Okay, continuing our series of videos about how to complete the user input pages for Sea Grant's integrated financial planning model for kelp aquaculture, we now turn to operating expenses. Now, if this is your first time viewing any of the videos in this series, you want to go to the first video in the series, which talks about how to set up the business model. At this point, as I said, we are going to be discussing entering data about operating expenses, and in prior videos we have entered startup costs for both a nursery operation and a farming operation. This example video series is assuming an integrated nursery and farming operation, just so that we have all of the permutation of data entry that you might encounter, but obviously you're going to individualize your data for your operation. So moving to the operating expenses page, then you can navigate either through these hyperlinks here in the graphic or by directly selecting one of the tabs in the workbook. Let's use the hyperlink and go to the operating expense page. Now, like every page in this model, the top section is essentially instructions for how to complete the page. If you don't feel like listening to my voice on these videos, you can go ahead and just work through these with the instructions in the text box. And then scrolling down, you get to the business model description that we had previously entered to define how we're doing business. It is the case for all of these worksheets in this model that these grayed out boxes do not allow you to enter data. If you try to do anything in this box, you get an alert that says that you can't. If you want to make any changes to your business model, you need to go back to the business model page and make the changes there so that they will flow through and not mess up the calculations in the model. Now, as I mentioned, this is an integrated model that we're working on here. We've got a nursery model that involves transporting our water in as opposed to pumping the water in to the kelp nursery. We are going to sell some of our seed string, and we're going to grow 50 total spools of seed string in our nursery model. In our farm model, we have a larger scale kelp farm, more than 2 lines, and we are going to sell our kelp in bulk as opposed to plucking it one frond at a time. And we are going to harvest 10,000 pounds in our first year of operations. Okay, so these are all just to remind you of the decisions that have already been made. Continuing to scroll down, then you'll notice that the data that you enter at the top of the operating expenses page is pretty limited. I mean, really, the operating expenses for running a kelp farm or nursery mostly have to do with labor, and in the case of the farm, it has to do with diesel to get out to the farm. In the case of the nursery, it involves utilities for running the nursery, but really it's mostly labor. And the labor rate, you'll notice that you have a prompt to enter the amount that you should consider yourself to be paying yourself. Now, you may or may not take a salary or take an hourly payment from your operations. When you're running a business, the last person who gets paid is the owner. But you need to take into consideration the question of how much you could be getting doing something else, right? And then, of course, there's the labor rate that you need to pay to your hired help, and we're going to give you an option to have a different rate for nursery operations versus farming operations because they're different activities. Okay, so let's go ahead and just enter in $25 for yourself, $30 an hour for helper in the nursery, and $25 an hour for hired labor for your farm. Okay, so those are really the only parameters that kind of flow through this whole page. All right, now if we continue scrolling down the page, In the nursery operations, and actually in both of these, we need to think about how many hours per quarter you're going to spend in this activity. A quarter is 3 months. A month you assume is 4 weeks. So if you say I'm going to work, 40 hours a week, you could do the calculation in here. So if I'm going to work full time, 40 hours a week times 4 weeks times 3 months, right? That'll give you a full-time load for the quarter, 480 hours. You'll notice that when you put that estimate for the number of hours that you're working in up here in the white cells, it automatically calculates down here in the gray cells. Okay, and these gray cells are protected. Okay, so let's go ahead and zero that out again just to discuss another thing that you might notice. You will notice down here in these gray cells that they are already populated with some of the expenses, the consumable expenses and depreciation expenses that flowed through from the startup page. Right, so here are the supplies and consumables that we had already made decisions about on the nursery sheet, and you can tell that it's coming from the nursery startup sheet because if you look up here where the cell reference is defined, right, you can see that it's coming from cell D46, 426, I'm sorry, in the startup nursery page. Okay, so for our nursery, we can go ahead and enter some hours that we'll be working, and I am going to assume for the purpose of this exercise that most of the labor in our kelp nursery operations is going to occur in quarter 3 and quarter 4. Okay, so you're going to grow the kelp seeds in quarter 3 and 4, and then in quarter 4, you're going to get them out into the water in the winter. Okay, and so again, you do want to acknowledge how much time you are spending working, and how much the what's called opportunity cost of your time is, because every hour that you're spending working in this nursery operation is an hour that you can't spend doing something else that could maybe bring you in that $25 an hour. So that's sort of from an economic perspective why we need to address that. So let's say we are going to spend 200 hours working each of those quarters, and we are going to have help with us the whole time. So 200 hours for our hired help as well. Okay, so that again automatically calculates down here in terms of our expenses, and you will notice also that you need to pull out these assumptions for your outlying year. So let's just go ahead and say the same thing for year 2 and for year 3. And then we need to make some estimates about how much our utilities are going to be during our busy time there. Let's say it's going to be $500 total for the quarter, for each quarter. And then we need to address the question of, vehicle costs for whatever kind of transportation we need to engage in our nursery operation. So let's say that's another $200 per quarter. Now these numbers obviously are just made up. And then you do have the option to add additional cost elements if you needed to. You can use those. You can do those at your discretion. Okay, so that's our nursery operations operating costs. Again, for this example, we've got it just going on in the second half of the year from July through December. If you have a year-round nursery operation, you would obviously complete this table for each quarter of the year. Okay, so that's the nursery operations in this integrated nursery and kelp farm. Moving down then, we have operating expenses associated with the kelp farming operation. And in particular, what you have are these annualized permitting expenses that are flowing through from the assumptions that we made on the startup page. Okay, these are automatically calculated. You may or may not have ongoing legal requirements or permitting requirements for your operations. This is a place where you can enter them if you do have those. Okay. Continuing on then, we move to the actual farm itself and the labor associated with building the farm, and then scrolling down, the labor associated with seeding the farm and the fuel, the labor associated with farm maintenance and the fuel, and harvest. And then the labor also associated with after or post-harvest. You need to disassemble the growing array. How long will that take you? Okay, so all of these tables, as you've noticed, I've scrolled through them just to kind of show that they're really repetitive, and it's really just having to do with the labor that you're spending and the fuel that you're spending to basically manage your farm. There are in each of these tables areas where you can put in other cost elements, just as there was for the nursery. And then the other thing that I want to note here is that in these gray cells, there is not only the calculation of the cost of your labor, which we'll get to in a minute, but also the depreciation expenses that come through for your array, which is sort of an annualized operating expenses for the cost of the array. And then down in this table here, there's the purchase of a seed string, which also comes from your startup costs. All right, so I don't necessarily want to fill all of these tables out, although I do want to put some estimates in here just so that you can see how it flows when we show the output of this. This is obviously going to be your farm, and you know what it is. So let's say we're gonna for building out the farm in the first year, it's going to be 50 hours for the owner and 100 hours. You got to have 2 people helping you for hired labor, and that's going to happen in the January time frame. And then you're going to get a little bit better at it the second year and only spend 40 hours and still have 2 people. And in the third year, you're also going to spend 40 hours. And let's say that the seeding, it's going to be 15 hours for the owner and 30 hours for friends or helpers each year, a couple of days. And then you're going to be maintaining your farm through the first quarter 1 and quarter 2. So, you see how it goes. I'm not going to force you to watch this whole this whole exercise of filling out every table, but you see how this flows through automatically for you and gives you actual cost estimates, not only for your own labor, which is not a cash expense but is an economic expense, as well as your paid labor. Okay, so you continue that process through all of the aspects of running a kelp farm, including harvest and then post-harvest. And then you get down to the bottom of this worksheet, which has to do with your annual overhead that is not directly addressed above in the in sort of the direct labor expenses of running your kelp farm. Things like maintenance for your truck. So let's say every year you got to spend $1,000 on your truck, whether you like it or not. You got to spend $1,000 in your insurance for the truck. You got to spend $150 to register the truck. Right? These are not expenses that are directly associated with growing the kelp, but they are expenses associated with running the business, and you need to keep them in mind. You're going to need to have some communication capacity. Let's say it's $50 a month times 12. You can use Excel's calculator function to do that. So 50 times 12. So there's your annual communication expenses, and then anything else that you may need that is not directly attributable to running that kelp farm or growing the kelp. You will also notice that there is some depreciation expense that flows through in here that comes from your startup assumptions that didn't get picked up in the tables above. Okay, so this is how you do the data entry for your operating expenses. Okay, so we separated out the expenses associated with running the farm and growing the kelp from the expenses of running the business, which is your overhead. And now we're ready to move on to the remainder of the worksheets. So the startup pages are done, the operating expenses are done, and now you're ready to move on to the remainder of the worksheets in this financial model.